Stupid Marco, even my little sister can read better than you. The cruel laughter of classmates echoed through the hallway of the prestigious Manhattan private school as 11-year-old Marco Castellano pressed himself against his locker, tears threatening to spill from his dark eyes. The reading assignment crumpled in his trembling hands. Another failure, another humiliation in a life already weighted down by expectations he could never meet. Clara Martinez adjusted her worn leather messenger bag as she witnessed the scene, her heart breaking for the boy who reminded her so much of her younger brother. At 29, she had dedicated her life to helping children with learning differences. But her position as a substitute teacher at this elite school was temporary. Just another stepping stone in her struggle to make ends meet in the expensive city. She approached Marco gently, kneeling to his level as the other children dispersed. "Hey there," she said softly, her voice carrying the warmth of her Mexican-American heritage mixed with years of New York living. "Those kids don't know what they're talking about. Sometimes our brains just work differently, and that's not a bad thing." Marco looked up at her with suspicious eyes, unused to kindness from adults who weren't paid to show it. Clara handed him a tissue and helped him gather his scattered papers, noticing immediately the telltale signs of dyslexia in his homework. Meanwhile, 20 blocks away in a glass-walled penthouse overlooking Central Park, Don Alessandro Castellano stood at his floor-to-ceiling windows, his reflection ghost-like against the Manhattan skyline. At 47, he commanded respect from Wall Street to Little Italy, his legitimate construction empire serving as the perfect front for less visible operations. His Italian-tailored suit fit his tall frame perfectly, but beneath the polished exterior lay a father's growing desperation. The private investigator's report sat heavy on his mahogany desk. Another tutor had quit, citing Marco's inability to focus and lack of motivation. Alessandro's jaw tightened as he remembered his own struggles with traditional education, the way his father had dismissed his difficulties as laziness. He had vowed never to let his son feel that same shame. Yet here he was, failing the most important job of his life, being Marco's father. Clara's small Greenwich Village apartment that evening was a stark contrast to the Castellano penthouse. Student loan bills covered her kitchen table, and her second-hand furniture spoke of someone making noble choices on a teacher's salary. She researched Marco's symptoms online, her education in special needs teaching immediately recognizing the classic presentation of dyslexia. The boy was brilliant. She could see it in his questions, his creative thinking. But the traditional teaching methods were failing him completely. The next morning at school, Clara found Marco in the library during lunch, struggling alone with a reading assignment that should have taken minutes. "Mind if I sit?" she asked, settling beside him with her own lunch, a simple sandwich that was all her budget allowed. "You know, I had a student once who saw letters differently. Want me to show you a trick that helped him?" Marco's eyes lit up with hope for the first time in months. Alessandro's day was interrupted by his phone buzzing with another call from the school. Marco had gotten into a fight. Something about being called names again. As he drove his black Bentley through Manhattan traffic, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, Alessandro felt the familiar rage building. Not at Marco, never at Marco, but at a world that refused to understand his son's brilliant mind, simply worked differently than others. When he arrived at the exclusive private school, Alessandro's presence commanded immediate attention. At 6'2", with steel gray eyes and perfectly styled dark hair, touched with silver, he carried himself with the quiet authority of a man accustomed to having his word become law. The principal practically genuflected as she led him to her office, where Marco sat with his head down, shame radiating from his small frame. "Mr. Castellano, Marco was involved in an altercation today. The other student made some unfortunate comments about his reading level, and Marco responded physically." Alessandro's face remained impassive as he listened, but his heart ached for his son. "However," the principal continued, "I should mention that Ms. Martinez, one of our substitute teachers, has taken a special interest in Marco. She's been working with him during lunch periods, and I've noticed some improvement in his engagement. Clara chose that moment to knock on the office door, her courage wavering as she saw the imposing figure of Marco's father. But when she looked at the boy's face, saw the fear and shame there, her teacher's instincts took over. "Excuse me, but I wanted to check on Marco. The incident today wasn't his fault. He was defending himself against bullies who don't understand that intelligence comes in many forms." Alessandro's eyes fixed on this young woman who dared to speak up for his son. She was beautiful in an understated way, with warm brown eyes and black hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, wearing a modest dress that suggested she lived on a teacher's salary. But it was her fierce protectiveness of Marco that caught his attention. The way she positioned herself slightly in front of the boy, as if shielding him from judgment. As Clara explained her observations about Marco's learning style, Alessandro found himself studying her with the same intensity he brought to business negotiations. She spoke with passion about different types of intelligence, about the need for individualized approaches, about seeing children as whole people rather than collections of test scores. And Marco, his son, who barely spoke at school, was nodding eagerly, adding his own thoughts to the conversation. For the first time in months, Alessandro saw hope blooming in his child's eyes, and he knew he would do whatever it took to keep that hope alive. The coffee shop near Columbia University had become Clara's evening refuge, where she graded papers and planned lessons on a budget that stretched each dollar. She looked up from her laptop to find the imposing figure of Alessandro Castellano approaching her corner table, his presence transforming the casual atmosphere into something charged with possibility and danger. "Ms. Martinez, I hope you don't mind the intrusion. I wanted to discuss Marco's education in a more private setting." Alessandro's offer was simple yet stunning. Private tutoring for Marco 3 times a week, at a rate that would solve Clara's financial struggles in a single semester. But as she studied his face across the small cafe table, Clara sensed layers of complexity beneath his businessman's exterior. "I've seen how my son responds to you," he said, his voice carrying a slight Brooklyn accent that his expensive education couldn't quite erase. For the first time in years, he actually wants to learn. Clara's small apartment was transformed when Alessandro saw it through her eyes, not as inadequate, but as a space filled with books, educational materials, and the warmth of someone who had built a home through love rather than money. When she agreed to tutor Marco, Alessandro insisted on providing supplies, specialized books for dyslexic learners, educational games, technology that could help his son succeed. "Money isn't the issue," he said quietly. "My son's happiness is priceless." The first tutoring session took place at Clara's kitchen table, with Marco arriving in a car worth more than her annual salary. But within minutes, the economic differences faded as Clara worked her magic, using colored overlays and specialized techniques to help Marco decode words that had always seemed like enemies. Alessandro waited in the car, watching through her window as his son laughed for the first time during a learning session. "Your father seems like he cares about you very much," Clara said as she and Marco worked through a reading exercise about baseball, his favorite sport. The boy's face grew thoughtful. "Dad tries really hard, but I know I'm not what he wanted. He's so smart, and I'm just broken." Clara's heart clenched at the casual way Marco dismissed himself, and she spent the next 20 minutes explaining how some of history's greatest minds had been dyslexic, including entrepreneurs and artists who saw the world differently. Alessandro found himself arriving earlier for pickup, drawn by the sound of laughter from Clara's apartment. He began accepting her offers of coffee, sitting in her modest living room while Marco finished exercises. Their conversations started with his son's progress, but gradually expanded to include Clara's dreams of opening a specialized learning center, his own struggles with traditional education, and the weight of expectations that shaped both their lives. The breakthrough came during their 3rd week of sessions. Marco read an entire children's book aloud, his confidence growing with each page. Clara's excitement was infectious, and when Alessandro arrived to find them celebrating with homemade cookies, he saw his son's genuine smile for the first time in months. "Dad, I read the whole thing. Miss Clara says I'm not stupid. My brain just works like an artist's brain." The joy in Marco's voice brought unexpected tears to Alessandro's eyes. Clara began to understand that the mysterious business success that allowed Alessandro to afford private schools and luxury cars came with its own burdens. He spoke carefully about his work, mentioning construction projects and family obligations in ways that suggested complexity beyond corporate boardrooms. But when he talked about Marco, his guard dropped completely, revealing a devoted father desperate to give his son the confidence he'd never had. The tension built gradually, like steam in a pressure cooker. Alessandro's protective instincts warred with his growing attraction to the woman who was transforming his son's life. Clara found herself looking forward to their conversations, drawn to the vulnerability he showed only when discussing Marco's education. Their connection deepened through shared concern for the boy, but underneath lay an undeniable chemistry that neither dared acknowledge. When Marco's regular school teacher called for a conference, praising his recent improvement and suggesting he might not need extra support much longer, Alessandro felt panic rather than relief. The thought of losing this connection to Clara, of returning to failed tutors and Marco's declining confidence, was unbearable. He found himself extending their conversations, finding reasons to discuss Marco's long-term educational needs. Clara sensed the shift in their dynamic but attributed it to Alessandro's dedication to his son's education. She had no idea that this caring father who drove a Bentley and spoke of family business was connected to anything beyond legitimate success. Her world remained focused on lesson plans and learning differences, on helping a bright boy overcome obstacles that society placed in his path. The evening when everything changed started innocuously enough. Marco had stayed late to finish a particularly challenging reading assignment, his concentration so intense that Clara decided to let him continue past their usual time. Alessandro was delayed by a business meeting that ran long, leaving Clara and Marco alone as darkness fell over Greenwich Village. Neither of them noticed the black SUV that had been following Alessandro's movements, or realized that their sanctuary was about to become something far more complicated and dangerous. Clara was helping Marco with a complex reading passage about space exploration when the apartment door suddenly burst open. 3 men in expensive suits entered without invitation, their movements fluid and menacing, while Alessandro appeared behind them with a face like carved granite. "Dad?" Marco's voice was small and confused as he looked between the strange men and his father's transformed demeanor. Clara instinctively moved closer to the boy, her teacher's protective instincts overriding her shock. "Nobody moves," Alessandro said, his voice carrying an authority that made Clara's blood run cold. This wasn't the gentle father who had shared coffee in her kitchen, or the businessman who spoke carefully about family obligations. This was someone else entirely. Someone dangerous. "Marco, come to me. Now." But the boy remained frozen beside Clara, his dyslexia suddenly seeming like the smallest of his problems as the adult world revealed its darker truths. The man who had seemed like an answer to Clara's prayers was speaking in rapid Italian to his associates, his tone brooking no argument. Clara caught fragments, something about security breach and exposure. When Alessandro's steel-gray eyes fixed on her, she saw calculation rather than the warmth she'd grown accustomed to. "Ms. Martinez, I'm afraid you've become inadvertently involved in a family matter that requires discretion." "Marco needs to understand," Alessandro continued, switching to English as he knelt to his son's level. "Daddy's work is complicated. Sometimes people want to hurt our family. So we have to be very careful about who knows where we are and what we do." Clara watched in horror as the 11-year-old boy processed that his father's construction business was something that required armed protection and secrecy. Clara's mind raced through every interaction, every conversation about Alessandro's work, every expensive gift and casual display of wealth. The pieces formed a picture she didn't want to acknowledge. The respectful way service workers treated him, the phone calls he took in Italian, the way he never quite explained how he could afford to pay her triple the going rate for tutoring services. "What exactly is your family business, Mr. Castellano?" she asked, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "The kind that requires absolute loyalty," Alessandro replied, his tone gentle but unmistakably threatening. "The kind that doesn't tolerate security risks or outside interference. The kind that protects its own by any means necessary." Clara's stomach dropped as she realized that her simple life as a teacher had just collided with a world she'd only seen in movies, and there was no director to yell, "Cut," when things became too intense. Marco's face crumpled as he finally understood that their peaceful tutoring sessions had been built on a foundation of secrets and potential danger. "Are you going to hurt Miss Clara?" he asked his father, tears streaming down his cheeks. "She's the only teacher who ever made me feel smart. Please don't hurt her." Clara's heart broke for the boy who was learning that the adults in his life were far more complicated than he'd imagined. Alessandro's jaw tightened as he saw his son's distress, the weight of his dual life pressing down on him like a physical burden. "Marco, Miss Clara is going to stay with us for a while. We need to make sure she understands how important it is to keep our family's private business private." Clara understood the implication immediately. She was no longer a tutor who could simply walk away at the end of their arrangement. "You can't just keep me here," Clara said, finding her courage despite the fear coursing through her veins. "I have a life, responsibilities, students who depend on me." But even as she spoke, she realized how isolated she really was. No family in New York, few close friends, a substitute teaching position that could easily be explained away. Alessandro had chosen well, whether intentionally or not. The apartment that had been her sanctuary now felt like a cage as Alessandro's men positioned themselves strategically around the space. "Your safety is now my responsibility," Alessandro said, his tone suggesting this was a burden rather than a choice. "There are people who would use any weakness against my family, and unfortunately, you've become a weakness. Marco's attachment to you makes you a target, and I won't allow that risk to exist uncontrolled." Clara looked at Marco, who was clinging to his father's arm while watching her with desperate eyes. The boy who had made such progress, who had finally begun to believe in his own intelligence, was now caught between his father's dangerous world and the teacher who had given him hope. "If I stay," Clara said carefully, "what happens to Marco's education? What happens to his progress?" She was buying time, trying to think, but also genuinely concerned for the child who had become the center of this impossible situation. Alessandro's expression softened slightly as he saw Clara's continued concern for his son, despite her own predicament. "That depends entirely on your willingness to adapt to our family's unique circumstances," he said. "Marco needs you, but our family needs security. The question is whether you can provide both education and discretion, because leaving is no longer an option for any of us." As Clara processed the reality that her simple life as a teacher had just become infinitely more complicated, she realized that her biggest challenge wouldn't be dealing with Alessandro's world. It would be managing her growing feelings for a man who had just made her his prisoner. Clara's first week of captivity in the Castellano penthouse revealed a world of contradictions that challenged everything she thought she knew about right and wrong. The luxury was undeniable. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park, a kitchen that belonged in a magazine, and a library that rivaled some university collections. But the armed guards and reinforced security systems served as constant reminders that this golden cage came with its own dangers and responsibilities. Marco's education continued, but now within the confines of Alessandro's fortress-like home. Clara found herself adapting her teaching methods to work with the extensive security measures. turning lessons into games that could be played away from windows using technology that Alessandro's people had carefully vetted for tracking capabilities. The boy's progress accelerated in this controlled environment, free from the bullying and pressure of his elite private school. Alessandro watched Clara's adaptation with a mixture of admiration and guilt. She had every right to hate him, to demand her freedom, to treat Marco with resentment for the situation he'd inadvertently created. Instead, she threw herself into the boy's education with renewed dedication, creating lesson plans that incorporated their unique circumstances while maintaining her fierce advocacy for his learning differences. "You're remarkable," he told her one evening as they reviewed Marco's progress. "Most people would have broken by now." "I'm not here by choice," Clara reminded him, her voice steady despite the complexity of her feelings. "But Marco didn't choose this either, and he deserves the best education I can give him, regardless of the circumstances." She paused, studying Alessandro's face in the soft lamplight of his study. "Besides, I'm beginning to understand that you didn't choose this life as much as you inherited it. That doesn't make it right, but it makes it human." The threats against the Castellano family materialized gradually, like storm clouds gathering on a clear horizon. Alessandro's rivals had noticed his change in routine, the way he now spent more time at home, the increased security around his son's activities. Clara overheard fragments of phone conversations in Italian, saw the tension in Alessandro's shoulders when he thought no one was watching, felt the electricity of danger that permeated their isolated world. "There are people who would hurt Marco to get to me," Alessandro explained during one of their evening conversations, his usual composure cracking slightly. "By bringing you into our world, I've made you a target too. If they can't reach him directly, they'll go after anyone he cares about. I can't apologize for protecting you, even if the method isn't ideal." Clara found herself torn between anger at her situation and understanding of his impossible choices. Marco's attachment to Clara deepened during this period of forced intimacy, but it also became a source of additional pressure. The boy began to see her as a mother figure, seeking comfort from her when Alessandro's business kept him away, confiding fears and dreams that revealed the emotional complexity of growing up in his father's world. "Do you think Miss Clara will ever forgive me for ruining her life?" he asked Alessandro one night, breaking his father's heart with the weight of guilt he carried. Clara's own feelings became increasingly complicated as she witnessed Alessandro's devotion to his son. She saw him reading Marco bedtime stories in accented English, helping with homework that his own dyslexia made challenging, lying awake at night worrying about threats she was only beginning to understand. The man who had taken her freedom was also fighting every day to protect the child she had grown to love, and the moral complexity was exhausting. The first direct threat came through Marco's abandoned school. Someone had been asking questions about his tutoring arrangements, about the young woman who had taken such interest in the Castellano boy's education. Alessandro's security team reported the inquiries with grim efficiency, and Clara watched him transform from loving father to cold strategist as he assessed the implications. "They're using our love for Marco against us," he said, his voice carrying deadly certainty. Clara found herself participating in security briefings, learning about protocols she'd never imagined needing. She discovered that Alessandro's construction empire was indeed legitimate, but it provided cover for operations that required the kind of protection she was now receiving. "Knowledge is both power and burden in our world," Alessandro explained as they reviewed escape routes and safe room procedures. "I'm sorry you have to carry this burden, but ignorance won't protect you anymore." The breaking point came when surveillance detected someone watching the building, photographing residents and visitors with telephoto lenses. Alessandro's men identified the watchers as associates of a rival family, people who wouldn't hesitate to use violence against civilians to send a message. Clara realized that her presence in the Castellano home had escalated from protective custody to active warfare, with Marco's education serving as the unlikely catalyst for a battle she never wanted to join. I need you to make a choice, Alessandro said that night, his voice heavy with exhaustion and responsibility. You can return to your old life, but it will mean losing Marco and accepting the risk that comes with knowing our secrets. Or you can commit fully to our family's protection, understanding that it means embracing a world you never asked to enter. Clara looked at Marco, who was sleeping peacefully in his bed, finally confident in his ability to learn, finally believing in his own intelligence. The choice, she realized, had already been made the moment she decided to see this remarkable child as more than his learning differences. The question now was whether she had the courage to fight for the family she was already beginning to love. The attack came at dawn on a Tuesday, when New York's financial district was just beginning to stir, and Marco was still sleeping peacefully in his bedroom. Clara woke to the sound of shattering glass and Alessandro's voice shouting orders in rapid Italian. She found him in the hallway, dressed in black tactical gear that transformed him from businessman to warrior, his face set in lines of deadly determination. "Stay with Marco," he commanded, pressing a panic button into her hand. "Whatever happens, don't leave that room." Maita, Clara's hand shook as she gathered the sleeping boy into her arms, carrying him to the reinforced safe room Alessandro had shown her during their security briefings. Marco's eyes were wide with fear as the sounds of conflict echoed through their home. Shouting voices, running footsteps, and the unmistakable crack of gunfire. "Miss Clara, are they here to hurt us?" he whispered, clinging to her as she activated the room's security systems according to Alessandro's instructions. Through the safe room's monitors, Clara watched Alessandro coordinate his men's defense with the precision of a military commander. He moved through his own home like a predator protecting his territory, every action calculated to preserve the sanctuary he'd built for his son. When one of the attackers made it to the residential floor, Clara saw Alessandro's face transform into something primal and terrifying as he eliminated the threat without hesitation. "I want my dad," Marco sobbed, his small body trembling against Clara's as explosions echoed from somewhere below. What if they hurt him? What if he doesn't come back? Clara found herself making promises she wasn't sure she could keep, telling Marco that his father was strong and smart and would protect them all. But inside, she was terrified that this beautiful, complicated man who had turned her world upside down might not survive the violence he'd tried so hard to shield his son from. The battle raged for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Clara watched Alessandro's security cameras as his men systematically repelled the attack, their training and superior position giving them advantage over the invaders. But when she saw Alessandro take a bullet to his shoulder, saw him stumble and nearly fall before continuing to fight, her heart stopped. "Your father is hurt," she whispered to Marco, not sure whether she was preparing him or herself for the worst. When the gunfire finally stopped, the silence was almost worse than the chaos. Clara waited in the safe room with Marco, both of them straining to hear signs of life from beyond the reinforced walls. When Alessandro's voice finally came through the intercom, tired, pained, but alive, Clara collapsed with relief she hadn't known she was holding. "It's over," he said simply. "You can come out now." Alessandro was sitting in his study when Clara and Marco found him, his left arm in an improvised sling and his white shirt stained with blood. But his eyes were bright with fierce protectiveness as he gathered his son into his good arm, pressing kisses to the boy's hair while murmuring reassurances in Italian. "I'm sorry you had to see this," he said to both of them. "I'm sorry I brought this danger into our home." Clara found herself kneeling beside Alessandro's chair, her hands checking his wound with the efficiency of someone who had taken first aid courses for her teaching job. "Don't apologize for protecting your family," she said firmly, meeting his eyes with steady certainty. "And don't apologize for keeping us safe. I understand now what you meant about the burdens of your world." As she spoke, Clara realized she was no longer speaking as a captive or even as Marco's tutor. She was speaking as someone who had chosen sides in a war she never wanted to fight. "They'll come again," Alessandro said quietly, his voice heavy with the weight of ongoing responsibility. This was a message, not a final solution. As long as Marco and I matter to each other, and as long as you matter to us, we'll all be targets. Clara looked at the man who had kidnapped her, who had forced her into his dangerous world, who had just nearly died, protecting them all. Then we'd better make sure we're ready for them, she replied, surprising herself with her resolve. Marco, exhausted by fear and adrenaline, fell asleep between them as Clara cleaned Alessandro's wound, and Alessandro made quiet phone calls to ensure their continued security. In the aftermath of violence, with blood on their clothes and uncertainty in their future, Clara realized that her feelings for this complicated man had crystallized into something unbreakable. She was no longer his prisoner or employee. She had become his partner in the most dangerous venture of all, protecting the brilliant, sensitive boy who had brought them together. "I love you," Alessandro said suddenly, his voice raw with exhaustion and honesty. "I know I have no right to feel that way, given how we met, given what I've put you through. But watching you protect Marco tonight, seeing your courage in the face of everything we've thrown at you, I can't pretend anymore." Clara looked at this powerful man who was vulnerable only when it came to his son and, apparently, to her. "I love you too," she whispered back, finally acknowledging the truth that had been growing through weeks of forced proximity and shared purpose. "I love you, and I love Marco, and I understand now. That means accepting all of this. The danger, the secrecy, the responsibility of being part of your family." As dawn broke over Manhattan, painting the sky in shades of hope and possibility, Clara made the final choice that would transform her from victim to willing participant in the Castellano family's complicated future. 3 months after the attack, Clara stood in the penthouse kitchen making Marco's favorite breakfast, while Alessandro conducted business calls in 4 languages from his home office. The apartment had been rebuilt and reinforced, transformed into a fortress that felt like a home, complete with a dedicated classroom where Marco's education continued to flourish under Clara's innovative teaching methods. The armed guards had become as familiar as doormen, and the bulletproof windows offered the same stunning views of Central Park they always had. Marco's transformation had been remarkable to witness. Free from the pressure and bullying of traditional school, supported by teaching methods designed for his unique learning style, he was reading at grade level and discovering a love for science that Alessandro encouraged with expensive equipment and patient attention. "Miss Clara says I might want to be an astronaut," Marco announced over dinner one evening, his eyes bright with possibility. "She says my brain sees patterns differently, which could be good for space exploration." Clara had adapted to her new reality with the same determination she brought to everything else in her life. She maintained contact with her former colleagues through carefully monitored communications, officially taking a leave of absence for a prestigious private tutoring position. Her small apartment in Greenwich Village had been quietly maintained by Alessandro's people, preserved as a connection to her old life while she built something entirely new in the heights of Manhattan luxury. Alessandro's shoulder healed slowly, but his emotional wounds ran deeper. The attack had forced him to confront the cost of his dual life, the way his legitimate business success couldn't fully protect his family from the consequences of his other activities. He threw himself into finding a solution that would provide security without sacrificing the love he'd found with Clara and the progress Marco had made under her care. "I've been thinking about retirement," Alessandro told Clara one evening as they walked through the private garden he'd had installed on the penthouse terrace. The city sprawled below them, glittering with possibility and danger in equal measure. Not from business entirely, but from the parts that put Marco at risk. "The construction company is profitable enough to stand alone, and I have enough invested to ensure our family's future without the additional complications." Clara understood the magnitude of what Alessandro was suggesting. She'd learned enough about his world to know that retirement wasn't usually an option. that walking away required careful negotiation and strategic positioning. "What would that mean for us?" she asked, her hand finding his as they stood among the roses that bloomed despite being 40 stories above the street. "For Marco's future? For the life we're trying to build together?" The negotiations took months of careful diplomacy, with Alessandro using his legitimate business success and strategic alliances to carve out a protected space for his family. Clara watched him navigate this complex world with the same patience and intelligence he brought to understanding Marco's learning differences, seeing patterns and possibilities that others missed. "I'm not abandoning my family's heritage," he explained to his associates. "I'm evolving it to protect the next generation." Marco's education became the public explanation for many of Alessandro's changes. The brilliant boy with dyslexia, whose unique needs required specialized attention, provided perfect cover for increased security, private tutoring, and reduced public appearances. Clara's role transformed from secret tutor to acknowledged educational specialist, her credentials and dedication making her the perfect explanation for the Castellano family's new priorities. The first test of their new arrangement came when Alessandro's former rivals made overtures of peace, seeking to establish business relationships with his legitimate enterprises while respecting the boundaries he'd established around his family life. Clara attended these meetings as Marco's educational advocate, her presence serving as both explanation and protection for the boy who remained the center of their world. "You've given me something I never expected to have," Alessandro told Clara on the anniversary of the day they met. They were in the penthouse library, surrounded by the specialized books and learning materials that had transformed Marco's relationship with education. "You've given me a family that feels safe, a son who believes in himself, and a love that makes all the risks worthwhile." Clara looked around the space that had become their sanctuary. Bulletproof windows that still let in natural light, security systems that protected without imprisoning, and most importantly, a sense of home that transcended the extraordinary circumstances that had brought them together. "You've given me purpose," she replied, her hand resting on the lesson plans that represented Marco's continued growth. "And a family I never knew I needed." Marco bounded into the library at that moment, carrying a book he'd just finished reading independently, a biography of Temple Grandin that had captured his imagination with its story of someone whose different brain had become her greatest strength. "Dad, Miss Clara, listen to this," he said, launching into an excited explanation of the scientist's work with animals and autism. Clara and Alessandro exchanged glances over the boy's head, both recognizing that this moment, this simple, beautiful moment of a child excited about learning, had been worth every risk they'd taken to protect it. 2 years later, Clara stood in the grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel, watching Marco confidently present his science project to a room full of educators and parents. At 13, he had become an advocate for learning differences, his articulate explanations of dyslexia, helping other children understand that their brains simply work differently, not defectively. Alessandro stood beside her in an impeccably tailored suit, his transformation from dangerous criminal to devoted family man complete in every way that mattered. The Castellano Learning Center had opened 6 months earlier in a renovated Manhattan townhouse, funded by Alessandro's legitimate business empire, and designed according to Clara's educational philosophy. Children with learning differences from across the city came to study in small classes with specialized teachers. Their progress measured not by standardized tests, but by growth in confidence and capability. Marco served as a peer mentor, his own journey inspiring younger students who struggled with similar challenges. Alessandro's business empire had indeed evolved into something entirely legitimate and even more profitable than his previous ventures. His construction company had expanded into educational facility development, building specialized schools and learning centers across the country. The skills that had made him successful in darker endeavors, strategic thinking, careful planning, understanding of human motivation, proved remarkably transferable to lawful enterprises. Clara wore Alessandro's grandmother's wedding ring now, the vintage platinum and diamond piece having been reset to reflect their modern love story. Their wedding had been small and private, held in the penthouse garden, with Marco serving as best man and Alessandro's reformed associates providing security that looked like normal celebration. The ceremony had been conducted in both English and Italian, honoring the cultural heritage that shaped their family, while embracing the American dream they were building together. Marco's academic success had opened doors to prestigious private schools, but he chose to remain at the learning center for his high school years, preferring the environment where his differences were understood and celebrated. His college applications were already impressive despite his youth, with early acceptance letters from universities that valued his unique perspective and advocacy work. "I want to study educational psychology," he announced at dinner one evening. "I want to help kids like me understand that being different can be amazing." The threats that had once defined their lives had faded into distant memory, replaced by the ordinary challenges of running a business, raising a teenager, and building a marriage based on mutual respect and shared purpose. Alessandro's former rivals had become legitimate business partners or faded into irrelevance, unable to threaten a family that had successfully transitioned from the shadows into the light. Clara's educational methods had gained national recognition, with invitations to speak at conferences and requests to consult on learning difference programs across the country. She remained connected to her roots as a teacher while embracing her role as an advocate for children whose intelligence didn't fit traditional molds. "Every child deserves to feel smart," she told audiences of educators and parents. "Sometimes that just requires teaching in a language their brain can understand." Alessandro often reflected on the chain of events that had brought them together: Marco's struggles in school, Clara's compassionate intervention, the dangerous world that had threatened to tear them apart, but ultimately brought them closer together. "I used to think love was a weakness that could be exploited," he told Clara as they watched Marco graduate from the learning center with honors. "Now I understand it's the strength that makes everything else possible." The penthouse remained their primary residence, but they'd also purchased a house in the Hamptons where Marco could experience typical suburban childhood activities like baseball games and neighborhood barbecues. The transition from city to country life suited all of them, providing space for growth while maintaining the security systems that were now more habit than necessity. Clara's influence had transformed not just Marco's education, but Alessandro's entire approach to business and family. Board meetings included discussions of employee education benefits, construction projects prioritized community development, and family dinners always included conversation about the learning center's students and their progress. "You've made us better people," Alessandro told her on their second anniversary. "You've shown us that power means nothing if it's not used to protect and nurture those we love." As Marco prepared for his sophomore year of high school and early college courses, Clara and Alessandro began discussing the possibility of expanding their family. The boy who had brought them together was thriving. Their love had deepened through challenge and triumph, and their future seemed bright with possibility. "Whatever comes next," Clara said as they stood together on their terrace, watching the sun set over the city that had given them everything. "We'll face it as a family." The last paragraph would typically include a call to action for viewers to follow the YouTube channel, but this story stands complete as a testament to the power of love, education, and family to transform even the most dangerous circumstances into something beautiful and meaningful. Marco's journey from struggling student to confident advocate, Clara's evolution from captive teacher to beloved family member, and Alessandro's transformation from dangerous criminal to devoted father prove that people can change, grow, and build new futures when motivated by love and guided by hope. If you enjoyed this story of unexpected love, protection, and family bonds forged in the most unlikely circumstances, Make sure to follow our channel for more captivating tales that explore the complex depths of human connection and the power of love to transform even the most dangerous situations into something beautiful.